Clean that mess up faster or you'll get another beating tonight." Those words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. I stood frozen in my own front doorway, keys still trembling in my hand, staring at a scene that would haunt me forever. After 10 years working Dubai's oil fields, dreaming of this moment every single day, this wasn't the homecoming I'd imagined. My name is Harold Mitchell. I'm 60 years old. And let me tell you something. In all my years, from my Navy days to the scorching desert heat of the Middle East, nothing prepared me for what I saw that afternoon on Magnolia Park Lane. Now you have to understand, I'd been planning this surprise for months. Every dollar I'd saved, every sleepless night under those blazing Dubai stars, it was all for this moment. Coming home to surprise my daughter Diana and finally meet my 5-year-old granddaughter Sophie face to face. Sure, we'd had video calls, but nothing beats holding your family in your arms, you know? The Orlando streets looked exactly as I remembered as my taxi pulled up to the white stucco house with the palm trees I'd helped plant before leaving. This was the house I'd bought for Diana with my first big petroleum engineering contract, my gift to ensure she'd always have a safe place to call home. God help me, I had no idea how wrong things had gone. I'd kept my arrival secret, wanting to see their faces light up when Grandpa Harold walked through that door. The key turned silently. Same lock I'd installed myself all those years ago. I stepped inside, grinning like a fool, ready to shout, "Surprise!" But that word died in my throat faster than a flame in a sandstorm. Through the hallway I could see into the living room, and what I witnessed there still makes my blood boil. My Diana, my strong, beautiful daughter who used to debate politics with me over Sunday dinner, was on her hands and knees scrubbing vomit off the tile floor. But here's the part that really got to me. She was wearing a dirty apron with words that made my stomach lurch. Caldwell family property, my daughter, labeled like livestock. Now, I've seen some ugly things in my 60 years on this earth. Combat situations in the Navy, industrial accidents on oil rigs, men pushed to their breaking point. But seeing your own child reduced to this? That's a special kind of hell that burns right through your soul. Suddenly this man, Christopher I'd learn later, his whole demeanor changed like someone flipped a switch. The cruel sneer melted into this fake-as-plastic smile as he spotted me in the doorway. "Dad, welcome home," he called out with the kind of false warmth that makes your skin crawl. What a wonderful surprise. Diana was just helping with some housework. You know how she is, always wanting to pitch in. The way he said it, all casual-like as if my daughter being treated like a servant was the most natural thing in the world. That's when I knew, really knew, that something was seriously wrong in this house. Diana scrambled to her feet faster than I'd ever seen her move, yanking off that degrading apron and shoving it behind a couch cushion like it was evidence of a crime. Which, as I'd later find out, it pretty much was. Her movements were frantic, desperate, and when she looked at me, I saw something in her eyes that broke my heart into a million pieces. Fear. My daughter was afraid. "Dad," she said, forcing a smile that wouldn't have fooled a blind man. "I'm fine, just tired." That's when I noticed a small figure peeking out from behind Diana's legs. Sophie, my granddaughter, seeing me in person for the first time. She had these big brown eyes, just like her mama, but they were filled with something that made my chest tight, confusion and worry that no 5-year-old should ever have to carry. "Mommy," Sophie whispered, her little voice barely audible. "Who is that man?" Let me tell you, those words cut deeper than any blade ever could. Despite all our video calls over the years, despite the bedtime stories I'd read to her over the computer screen, I was still a stranger to my own granddaughter. That's what 10 years of chasing success in foreign countries gets you. You become a ghost in your family's life. I crouched down to her level, trying to keep my voice gentle despite the storm raging inside me. "Hey there, sweetheart. I'm your Grandpa Harold. Remember me from our video calls? I've been working far away, but now I'm here to visit you and Mommy." But Sophie just buried her face against Diana's leg, overwhelmed by everything happening around her. And that's when I saw it, when Diana placed a protective hand on her daughter's head, a dark purple bruise wrapping around Diana's forearm like a sick bracelet. "Diana," I started to say, but she must have seen where my eyes were looking because she quickly pulled down her sleeves, shooting me a look that screamed, "Not now, Dad!" Christopher, this parasite who'd somehow wormed his way into my family, clapped my shoulder like we were old buddies. The touch made my skin crawl. She's been a little clumsy lately, he said with this hollow laugh that had zero warmth in it. You know how women can be, always bumping into things. Now, I've heard that excuse before, and it never means anything good. Standing there in what should have been a joyful family reunion, watching my confident daughter cower like a beaten dog and my granddaughter hide from the grandfather she barely knew, one thought crystallized in my mind with absolute clarity. I needed to find out exactly what had happened to my family while I was gone, and I had a sinking feeling the truth would be far uglier than anything I'd seen in all my years. About 3 hours later, I finally got my chance to talk to Diana alone. Christopher had left for what he called a business meeting, though the whiskey smell on his breath at 2 p.m. told a different story. Sophie was taking her nap, and for the first time since I'd walked through that door, the house felt like it could breathe again. You know that feeling when someone's been holding you underwater and suddenly they let go? That's what the atmosphere was like without Christopher's presence poisoning the air. Diana sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped her with homework all those years ago, staring at her hands like they belonged to someone else. In the afternoon, Florida sunshine streaming through the windows, those bruises were even more visible. And let me tell you something. I've seen enough accidents on oil rigs to know the difference between a bump and deliberate harm. What I was looking at wasn't clumsy. It was systematic. "Diana," I said gently, pulling up the chair across from her, the same spot where I used to sit when she'd tell me about her day at school. "Tell me about those bruises. And don't you dare say you're clumsy. I raised you, remember? You were the most coordinated kid on the entire block." She flinched like I'd struck her, wrapping her arms around herself defensively. "It's nothing, Dad, just work accidents. I've been doing physical tasks around the house, helping with renovations." Her voice had this hollow quality that reminded me of shell-shocked soldiers I'd served with. Now this wasn't my Diana talking. My daughter used to look me straight in the eye when we talked, used to challenge me on everything from football teams to foreign policy. This frightened woman, avoiding my gaze, this wasn't the girl who'd argued with her high school principal about unfair dress codes and won. I reached across that table and took her hand, carefully, because I could see how tender those wrist marks were. "Diana Rose Mitchell," I said, using her full name like I had when she was little and needed to know I meant business. "Remember what I promised you the day you were born? I told you I'd always protect you no matter what. That promise doesn't have an expiration date, sweetheart." That's when the dam finally broke. Her face just crumpled, and she started sobbing like her heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces. All that fear, all that pain she'd been holding inside, it all came pouring out at once. "Oh, Daddy," she cried, using the name she hadn't called me since she was maybe 10 years old. "I messed up so bad. I messed up so bad." She told me everything then, and God Almighty, it was worse than anything I could have imagined. See, about 2.5 years ago, Diana had needed emergency gallbladder surgery. Should have been routine, but she had what the doctors called severe complications. Her body didn't process the anesthesia right, and the pain medication they gave her afterward hit her like a freight train. "I was so sick, Dad," she whispered, wiping her nose with a tissue that was already soaked through. Everything was foggy for weeks. I couldn't think straight, couldn't even remember what day it was half the time. Christopher's family said they'd help take care of everything while I recovered. The bills, Sophie, the house maintenance, everything. Here's where it gets really ugly. While my daughter was basically out of her mind on heavy medication, barely able to recognize her own reflection in the mirror, the Caldwell family started bringing her papers to sign. Insurance forms, they called them, medical authorizations, temporary arrangements. I signed whatever they put in front of me. Diana continued, her voice getting smaller with each word. "I trusted them, Dad. They were supposed to be family. I thought they were helping. What they were actually doing was stealing her life right out from under her. Property transfer documents, power of attorney forms, legal papers that basically made her a servant in her own home." When the medication fog finally cleared and I started understanding what I'd actually signed, she looked around the kitchen that should have been hers. They told me I'd signed the house over to them, said I was now their live-in caregiver, working off the debt of their help during my recovery. The rage that built up inside me at that moment, I can't even describe it properly. It was like every protective instinct I'd ever had as a father, every lesson the Navy had taught me about defending what's right, every hard-earned dollar I'd sweated for in those Dubai oil fields, all of it crystallized into pure, white-hot fury. They said if I didn't obey, Diana's voice cracked completely. If I tried to leave or cause trouble, they'd prove I was an unfit mother and take Sophie away from me. So I stayed, Dad. I've been their servant in my own home for 2.5 years. She got up then and walked to a kitchen drawer, pulling out this thick manila folder that was held together with rubber bands. I kept everything, though, she said with the first spark of defiance I'd heard from her all day. Medical records, copies of the papers I signed, everything. I kept hoping that someday someone would help me understand what really happened. As I opened that folder and started reading through the documents, one thought echoed in my mind louder than the sound of drilling equipment on a busy rig. The Caldwell family had just made the biggest mistake of their miserable lives when they decided to mess with Harold Mitchell's daughter. Now, I may have been 60 years old, and I may have spent the last decade halfway around the world, but I was still Diana's father. And there's nothing, and I mean nothing, more dangerous than a father who's discovered someone has been hurting his child. The war was about to begin, and the Caldwells had no idea what they'd just awakened. That night, I spread Diana's medical records across the kitchen table like a detective working the case of his life. And you know what? That's exactly what I was, a detective, a prosecutor, and a one-man army all rolled into one extremely pissed-off father. What I found in those documents made my blood run colder than a North Sea oil platform in January. The dates told a story that was even more sinister than I'd imagined. Diana had signed those property transfer documents on March 15th. But here's the kicker. According to her medical chart, March 15th was also the exact day her doctor had cranked her pain medication up to maximum levels because of severe post-surgical complications. Now, I've managed drilling crews for over 20 years, and let me tell you something about reading technical documents. The devil's always in the details. And these details were screaming fraud louder than a blowout alarm. The next morning, I was knocking on the doors of Orlando General Hospital before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. Sometimes being an early riser pays off in ways you never expect. Dr. Barbara Thompson, Diana's former physician, agreed to meet with me after I explained what had happened to my daughter. "Mr. Mitchell," Dr. Thompson said, pulling Diana's thick medical file from her cabinet like she was handling evidence, "I remember your daughter very well. Her case was one of the most severe medication reactions I've ever treated in 15 years of practice." She started flipping through pages of notes, and I watched her expression change from professional interest to genuine alarm. During March of that year, Diana was barely functional. We had her on oxycodone and lorazepam, heavy-duty medications that severely impair cognitive function and decision-making ability. "What does that mean in plain English, Doc?" I asked, though my gut already knew the answer was going to make me even angrier. "It means she was in absolutely no condition to make any legal decisions whatsoever," Dr. Thompson said, her voice getting firmer with each word. "The medication levels we prescribed would have left her confused, disoriented, and highly suggestible. Mr. Mitchell, she shouldn't have been signing birthday cards, let alone property documents." That's when Dr. Thompson called in Jennifer Walsh, the nurse who'd worked most closely with Diana during her recovery. Jennifer took one look at the timeline and her face went white as a sheet. "Oh my God," Jennifer said, shaking her head like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "I remember those days clearly. Diana was so heavily medicated that some days she couldn't even recognize her own mother when she came to visit. She would just stare at people like she was looking through thick fog." Jennifer sat down heavily in the chair next to me. I specifically remember one afternoon when she tried to sign her name on a get well card from her church group. Her handwriting was so shaky and illegible that we had to help guide her hand just to make a scribble. There's absolutely no way she could have understood complex legal documents. Dr. Thompson pulled out Diana's medication log and pointed to the dates with her pen. "Look at this timeline, Mr. Mitchell. March 10th through March 20th was her absolute worst period. We were seriously considering hospitalization because she was barely responsive to verbal commands. And the Caldwell family had her sign legal papers during this exact time?" I asked, my voice tight with the kind of rage that comes from deep in your belly. "If what you're telling me is accurate, then what they did wasn't just morally reprehensible. It was legally invalid," Dr. Thompson said with the kind of authority that comes from years of medical training. "A person under this level of medication cannot give informed consent for anything, especially something as significant as property transfer." Jennifer nodded so emphatically I thought her head might come off. "I would testify to that in any court in the country." During those days, Diana couldn't have told you what day of the week it was, let alone understood the implications of signing away her house. Dr. Thompson handed me a printed summary of Diana's treatment during that critical period. Mr. Mitchell, those signatures are legally worthless. No court in the country would uphold contracts signed by someone in Diana's condition. What the Caldwell family did constitutes elder abuse and exploitation of a vulnerable adult under Florida state law. Now let me tell you something about hope. When you've been carrying around rage and helplessness for hours, and suddenly someone hands you a weapon that can actually fight back, it's like getting a second wind during the longest shift of your life. As I walked out of that hospital with Dr. Thompson's medical summary clutched in my hands, I felt something I hadn't experienced since walking through Diana's front door. Real, genuine hope. For the first time since discovering this nightmare, I knew we had a legitimate chance to fight back and win. The Caldwell family thought they were being clever, preying on a sick woman who had no one to protect her, but they'd just made a critical miscalculation. They'd messed with Harold Mitchell's daughter, and now I had the ammunition to absolutely destroy them. But I knew I couldn't do this alone. Taking down a wealthy, connected family like the Caldwells was going to require more than righteous anger and medical records. I needed a lawyer, not just any lawyer, but someone who specialized in exactly this kind of predatory behavior. A quick internet search on my phone led me to the offices of Phillips and Associates, specialists in elder abuse and exploitation cases. Catherine Phillips had a reputation for taking down powerful families who thought their money made them untouchable. Her downtown Orlando office was on the 15th floor of a glass tower, with views that probably cost more per month than most people's salaries. But I didn't care if I had to mortgage my soul. Nobody was going to hurt my family and get away with it. The receptionist told me Ms. Phillips could see me that afternoon. As I sat in that waiting room, looking out at the Orlando skyline, I made a promise to myself and to Diana. The Caldwell family's reign of terror was about to come to a very expensive end. Catherine Phillips turned out to be exactly the kind of lawyer you want in your corner when you're going to war. She was a woman in her early 50s with silver hair pulled back in a sharp bun and eyes that could probably cut through steel. The kind of person who'd seen every dirty trick in the book and had a few of her own up her sleeve. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, gesturing to a leather chair that probably cost more than my first car, "tell me about your daughter's situation. Don't leave out any details, no matter how small they might seem." I laid out everything for her: the degrading apron, Diana's post-surgical complications, the suspicious timing of those document signings, and Dr. Thompson's damning medical assessment. Catherine took notes on a yellow legal pad, occasionally asking pointed questions that told me she knew exactly where this was heading. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and tapped her pen against her lips. "Mr. Mitchell, this is textbook exploitation of a vulnerable adult. What the Caldwell family did isn't just morally despicable, it's a federal crime." She spread Diana's medical records across her desk, cross-referencing them with photocopies of the property transfer documents I'd brought. "Look at this timeline. Your daughter signed away a $320,000 house while she was so heavily medicated she couldn't recognize her own mother. Any first-year law student could get these contracts voided." "But here's what makes this case really special," Catherine continued, her voice taking on the kind of edge that probably made opposing lawyers break out in cold sweats. "The Caldwell family didn't just commit fraud. They created a pattern of ongoing abuse, forcing Diana to wear that apron, making her work as an unpaid servant, threatening to take away her child. That's human trafficking, Mr. Mitchell. Now, I've been around long enough to know when someone's blowing smoke and when they're dead serious." Catherine Phillips was dead serious, and that gave me the first real hope I'd felt since walking through Diana's door. The next morning, Catherine and I drove through the gates of the Caldwell estate in Winter Park. Let me tell you something about wealthy people. They love their symbols of power. This mansion was 3 stories of Florida stone with towering columns, the kind of place that screams "we're better than you" from a mile away. A butler, an actual butler, led us through marble hallways lined with oil paintings of dead Caldwells. George Caldwell waited in his mahogany study like some kind of feudal lord, seated behind a desk that was probably bigger than most people's bedrooms. "Mr. Mitchell," he said without bothering to stand up, voice dripping with the kind of condescension that comes from generations of inherited privilege. "I understand you have concerns about your daughter's living arrangements. Diana is very happy working for our family." "Working?" I said, keeping my rage controlled but letting just enough of it show to get his attention. You mean being your unpaid slave in her own house? George laughed like I'd just told him the funniest joke he'd heard all year. You're nobody, Mitchell. My family has owned this city for 4 generations. We have judges, politicians, and police commissioners in our pocket. You think one old man can threaten us? That's when Catherine stepped forward and placed that thick folder of evidence right on his fancy desk. Mr. Caldwell, I'm attorney Catherine Phillips. These are your daughter-in-law's medical records from Orlando General, along with expert testimony from her physician. She opened the folder with surgical precision. On March 15th, Diana signed property documents while under maximum dose psychiatric medications. Dr. Barbara Thompson states that Diana was so heavily medicated she couldn't recognize her own mother. George barely glanced at the documents, but I could see uncertainty starting to creep into his eyes. Diana signed voluntarily. We have witnesses. You exploited my daughter's illness. I leaned forward, letting 20 years of Navy training and 10 years of oil field toughness show in my voice. That's a federal crime, Caldwell. Human trafficking, exploitation of a vulnerable adult, fraud. Catherine smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Mr. Caldwell, you have 48 hours to return Diana's house and pay $1.2 million in damages. If you refuse, we file civil and criminal complaints with the FBI. George's face went from condescending smirk to bright red fury in about 2 seconds. You just declared war on the wrong family, Mitchell. We'll destroy you and that pathetic daughter of yours. You already tried, I said, standing up to look him right in the eye. But you made one crucial mistake. You left me alive to fight back. 47 hours later, the Orlando Sentinel's front page told the whole ugly story. The headline screamed, "Wealthy family exploits daughter's illness to steal home," and suddenly the whole city knew what the Caldwells had done. The courthouse was packed 3 weeks later when Judge Helen Crawford delivered her verdict. Based on the medical evidence presented, she said with the kind of authority that brooks no argument, it's clear that Ms. Diana Mitchell was not competent to sign these documents. The property transfer is hereby declared null and void, effective immediately. 6 months after that, I sat in the same courthouse watching Christopher Caldwell get sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for arson, attempted murder, and human trafficking. George got 6 years for fraud and exploitation. Their fancy estate was seized to pay the $1.2 million in damages they owed us. But you know what the real victory was? It wasn't the money or seeing those parasites in orange jumpsuits. It was the evening a few weeks ago when I was pushing Sophie on her new swing set, the one we'd built together in our backyard, while Diana tended her flower garden. Grandpa Harold, Sophie called out, using my name naturally now, like she'd been doing it her whole life. Will you live with us forever and always? I caught that swing and knelt down to look into those brown eyes that reminded me so much of her mama. Forever and always, sweetheart. Wild horses couldn't drag me away. From the porch, Diana called out, her voice thick with the kind of emotion that comes from finally being free. Dad, thank you for saving us. Thank you for never giving up. As the Florida sun set over our little piece of paradise and Sophie ran off to chase fireflies, I realized something important. Sometimes what looks like the end of your story is really just the beginning of the best chapter you'll ever write.